Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. The month of May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Joining me is my friend Jason Chu, a passionate activist and a dynamic rapper whose music serves as a platform for social change. Together, we explore the often overlooked and hard truths of history, particularly concerning the AAPI community. In a world where solidarity is more crucial than ever, we discuss why understanding the full scope of history is essential. Despite the importance of these narratives, they often remain obscured or neglected in mainstream education. I'm deeply grateful to Jason for his invaluable insights and for enriching this conversation, from which I've learned a tremendous amount, and I hope you will too. Listen on as we confront the uncomfortable truths, celebrate the resilience, and advocate for the recognition and understanding that AAPI heritage deserves. For those that don't already know, Jason Chu is a rapper and activist who speaks hope and healing in a hurting world, matching high-energy performances and hard-hitting lyricism. As a kid in suburban Delaware, he found a vocabulary for racial identity and liberation in hip-hop culture. He now tours extensively, bringing a clear and urgent voice to stages from around the country and globally. His music has been heard in American Born Chinese on Disney+, Joyride, Warrior on Max and Netflix, The Mayans, Kung Fu, Snowpiercer, and Wu Assassins. As an expert on Asian American identity and hip-hop culture, Jason has spoken at colleges, conferences, and beyond. Check out his work on jasonmusic.com. As always, if you enjoy my podcast, please rate it on your platform of choice and share it with others. If you would like to support with a donation to help keep this podcast going and support the work I do, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com/SifuMimiChan. For comments or suggestions, reach out on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Jason. Nice to see you.
Good to be with you again, Sifu Mimi.
Oh my goodness. This is our fourth podcast together, and I'm super psyched because I've since now got to hang out with you in person multiple times.
That's right. You could say the podcast really brought us back together and helped us build our friendship.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Of course, we had met before and you being a Wallum family, but I mean, this has been really cool because now we've actually gotten to do events together as well as have some family and just personal time. It's been absolutely amazing and I adore you. And I'm so grateful you're joining me for the AAPI Heritage Month kickoff. Because I can think of no one better to educate everyone on all the things, being that you are just killing it on your social media. And I am so grateful because I know there's a bunch of textbooks and things and wonderful books that I have read, but there's so many more out there, but it's just tough to kind of get the time to sit and get through. And you literally in a minute, basically just are dropping so much knowledge. So I appreciate them because it allows me to continue to learn. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no, I am super happy. It's, obviously I do music, but really the message has always been exactly what you and Make Us Visible Florida have been fighting for. So it makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad to be back with you.
Yeah, 100%. So last year during AAPI Heritage, I had on a lot of AAPI mental health experts because, of course, it overlaps with mental health awareness. And I always have these kind of mixed feelings about heritage and history months and things like that, because obviously we should be learning all year round, which is, of course, why we're doing the education initiative. This is history. We should always be learning all the facets. But at the same time, it's kind of nice to be able to have celebratory moments, special events that happen. I know it keeps you really busy because you're going around the country and sharing, whether it's lectures or performing and education, but So I have mixed feelings because I'm like, well, we should be doing this all year. But at the same time, it's nice to be able to have some intentional celebration. And from my like understanding, it started in like 1990 to, the government basically designated it. And like, had you always been really aware of AAPI Heritage Month through school or whatnot? Or has this been something like over time that because of your activism, like you're very, very involved in?
Yeah, I think honestly, I didn't have any sense of AAPI or Asian Pacific American Heritage Month growing up. I do think part of it is we got we got kind of a crap month, right? Because it's towards the end of the school year. And so growing up, right, usually a lot of these things, Women's History Month, Black History Month, as you say, really every week, every month should be Women's History Month, Black History Month, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. That's not quite how our schools work. Most of it is, frankly, men's and White History Month, and we get what we do. And in particular, for AAPI communities, we get May, which there is some significance to it. I believe it's the anniversary of when Filipino American sailors first landed at Morro Bay. So there's some meaning to it, but what it winds up functionally doing is, universities end their school year end of April. A lot of high schools, middle schools, they're winding down in May. So I was not aware of it until I became what my mentor calls a professional Asian American. Until I was out there doing this work, and then you realize, oh, there's the events are Lunar New Year and in May.
Yes.
So it was really only once I was in my 20s, and I do think that's starting to change now. But still, I meet a lot of people who have no idea that May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
Yeah, I've kind of had the same experience. If it weren't for Kung Fu and the fact that some places may hire a lion dance or something, I don't know that I would have been aware. And I definitely didn't learn it in school. Because like you said, that last month of May ends up being test periods and all that too. So like the focus is very much like preparing you to test, which is a lot of school, right? It's just preparing you to learn how to take tests. But which we could go on a whole rant about that because I know you're very, very educated and your mom and everybody like, so yeah, I am aware like there's a lot of deficits here in our learning. But I was actually curious because since I was a youngster, there's been so many different ways to describe Asian American and Pacific Islander and, Native Hawaiian. And then we have like AA and HPI. Like there's so many different acronyms. And I always feel like, wow, right when I'm starting to learn, there's more to learn. And I'm trying to understand everyone's identity to ensure that no one gets left out. And I always feel like, what's the quote unquote right one? And there's no right or wrong in terms of like, if you're trying to be inclusive, but I always feel like, man, just when I thought I had it, now there's another letter that I'm missing, or I need to drop one. And it's just like, it's really frustrating. And I think that might also be part of the problem, right? Like it doesn't make it accessible and easy for everyone to just go, okay, well, this is what it is. Like Hispanic Heritage and Black History Month have kind of that advantage where it's so encompassing and it's easy to make it define. Whereas because Asian Americans are such a huge, I mean, how many countries are represented? It's just, it's hard to define, right? Like, because you communicate so much with the public in different places around the US. And I would imagine in certain spaces, they're like, you should use this or you should use that. Like, how do you help people understand and clarify that better?
Yeah, so I do think there are actually similarities in, let's say, Black or Hispanic communities, right? Okay. So, for one, right, the thing that I think is most akin to it in the Black community is the difference between, descendants of slaves versus more recent African immigrants,
right?
And so I think, frankly, actually, the fact that Blackness is considered considered more monolithic than Asian American Pacific Islander identity is somewhat of a misnomer.
Yeah.
It's somewhat of a
Okay.
misconception because I've heard this argued actually by Black folks, colleagues in grad school, when they
Yeah.
said there's actually an issue with talking about Blackness, which is that Black culture starts to become painted in broad strokes, when
Right.
in reality, right, like Gullah Geechee heritage is very different from, let's say like the Deep South
Hmm.
versus the urban South
Right.
versus,
Right.
New England versus Chicago. And so I point that out to point out that really, whenever we're talking about these coalitional groups, there is, this is what I said last week at a lecture in New York. We're not the same. And that's never been the point of a racial identity, right?
Hmm.
The point of a racial identity, the point of unity and solidarity has never been to say, hey, forget all the ways we're different. Let's just talk about the things that we have in common. That's never the point, right? The point of creating a unified group to fight battles together and to have shared common causes is always to say, hey, we're actually really different, but
Hmm.
here are some ways we can care for each other.
Right.
And so I think that goes into this conversation around, is it Asian American? Is it API? Is it APITA? Is it ANAPISI? Is it
Yes. Yeah.
ANHPI? I have heard and used all four of those in the last week.
I,
Right. And I think, and this is what I said last week. I said, when I say Asian American, I mean Asian American.
Mhm.
When I say Asian American and Pacific Islander, or, if I call out Desi Americans, right, South Asians, I try to do so intentionally, right? In the same way that, if you see somebody on the street, and you're just like, how do you describe this person? I have no clue who this person is. So I'm just going to, like, I'm going to try to get as close as I can. I'm going to say, hey,
Right.
that guy over there. I don't know if that's a guy. It might be a lady. It might be a boy. I remember when I was a kid, I was well spoken, but I had a high pitched voice. And people would call me ma'am on the phone. And I'd be like, oh, I'm not a ma'am, but, whatever. We're all trying. And I
Right.
think what's important for us is, it's honestly, I don't care what words or acronyms we use. What I
Yes.
care is that we're informed, right? If you forget to call out Native Hawaiian experiences, that's just what it is. But are you informed about, the illegal annexation of Hawaii by a group of 13 American and European settlers, or do you have no clue what's going on in Hawaii? Because you can say AA and HPI, but if you don't understand the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, the land back movement in Hawaii, their continued struggles with settlers and tourism and plantations and wealthy continental Americans buying up
Yeah.
land in Hawaii and taking away water from the folks who need it. If we don't understand all these things, it doesn't matter if we say ANHPI.
Hmm.
And so that, for me, the way I try to approach it, and Lord knows I don't always do well with this, but the way I try to approach these convos is, what are we really talking about here? Instead
Hmm.
of virtue signaling and getting all the words right and getting all the acronyms right, I'd rather learn and listen as to why people have these identities more than try to jump to the end, jump to the finish line and
Hmm.
say, hey, I'm using all the right words, I'm using the right phrases to refer to this group of people, so I must be in solidarity, when maybe I haven't lifted a finger to do anything for their causes.
Yeah, that's actually really refreshing to hear because it allows us to kind of take a step back, like you said, from the virtue signaling and making sure, or even feeling so self-conscious about it, right? Because I always, I always go, oh man, I'm just like in a different generation than a lot of the kids I teach, for example, right? Or even a lot of
Mhm.
the teens and the school students that we were working with through Make Us Visible Florida and doing the education, and you're just trying to guide them in the best way you can. And like you said, I think that's the key. It's if you're going to use specific terminology, understand it. And that is exactly why, and this is a bit of a tangent, but exactly why we were kind of like, okay, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, what went into our legislative law specifically, because that's kind of what represented our coalition. We did have Pacific Islanders, we did have Asian Americans, and it was like to add on and to be, to try to represent something that we didn't really have a lot of information or knowledge on, or even historical context on, to be able to go, hey, we're ready to educate everyone on these things that we don't know. Not that we're excluding the other, histories or that portion of Asian American history, but like it was like very much like that's how our coalition operates. It's however the community that's working feels comfortable with. And I think you articulated it so well, because it's not to be exclusive, but it's more to be true to what we feel we understand and who we are at the moment, right? And it's just and it's ever evolving. And I find it interesting
Mhm.
because people seem to get very, yeah, well, but you said this last year. I'm like, well, I hopefully have learned more by this year. And hopefully this year I can change my mind, or I can now say I've learned this and here's where I'm at. And I think that's really important for us as we all think about AAPI Heritage Month or Asian American History Month, however you want to call it, right? Whatever the letters you use, I think that's what we kind of focus on is each year, whether you're using whichever acronym, it's like, what have you learned this year? Where are you at? And I think I know for sure, especially here in Florida, like after working on our activity book, it was like, wow, we need to get more Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian culture into the Florida history, because of
Mhm.
course we're such a small dot in the speck of this whole world and this whole history. Like we have time to grow that, and it's kind of like it allowed us to see where we were lacking in representation, right, in our state, and was like, oh wow, okay, so we didn't feel comfortable putting AAPI on the cover of the book because it was mostly Asian American experiences, right? It was mostly like Asian. East Asian, Southeast Asian experiences, things like that. Not to say there isn't historical context, because I mean, it's a little kid's book, right? So, but you
Yeah.
know that we're going to hear about it, right? We're going to hear about, well, how come you don't have this, or that? And it's like, because it's a kid's book and you can't include everything under the sun, but it's an interesting way, I think, that you framed it in terms of just opening to listening, learning, and use things that you know, understand, and have you done the work. And it's kind of that kind of falls into, and I think you and I have spoken to this, is the cultural appropriation thing, right? It's like, well,
Mhm.
if you're not borrowing, but if you're honoring like hip hop culture or Black culture or all of that, it's like, do you actually know about it? Have you hired Black musicians? Have you worked with other people, or are you just like taking things as they're your own? So I feel like that kind of overlaps a bit, like that whole cultural appropriation talk or discussion that's always happening.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a very interesting place to take it because as you say that, I think about, what's the purpose of AANHPI Heritage Month, right? What's the goal here? And I think, frankly, there's a couple different versions of it, right? There's a version of it that that is frankly assimilative, and there's a version of it that is, I don't want to say the wrong word for you here because I know you're in Florida, but there's I'll just describe it like this. There's a version of ANHPI Heritage Month that pats America on the back for having Asians and Pacific Islanders here. And then there's a version of it that asks the question, why are we here? Why are we sometimes not visible? Why are we sometimes rendered invisible? And how does America act instead of assuming that America has lived into its values? how do we hold America to its values and ask America to live up to its values? And I think that the former is an easier sell
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't make anybody uncomfortable, right? Nobody
Right.
has to be the bad guy, right? If Americans and Pacific Islanders are just invisible, but hey, you fought adversity historically, some terrible things happened, but hey, now here we are celebrating and accepting.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit of a different. It's a slight difference, but it's a crucial difference between that kind of celebration of heritage and the celebration of heritage that asks questions that are actually still alive today, instead of just recognizing what exists and patting people on the back,
Mm-hmm.
saying, where's this still going on? Who is being treated in this way today in America or by America? And how do we live up to what we're proclaiming?
Yes.
That's the kind of AAPI Heritage Month that I'm interested in celebrating for sure.
Yes, yes. And this kind of leads me to, I'll share with my audience. Like, I was like all over the place. Like, I knew I wanted to talk to you. I didn't reach out early enough. And you were nice enough to be like, yes, I will fit you in
Of course.
because you're just amazing that way. So I didn't need to really prepare for this in terms of, oh, let me get all these questions for Jason. I was like, I just want to go down your Instagram reel list and be like, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. Because I'll tell you, Oscar, my husband, because we've dined together and everything, and
Oh
he
my
is
God.
very not on social, but when I let him listen to some of your stuff, he's like, oh my gosh, I am so inspired and motivated by him to just be a better person and also to articulate better and communicate better. And especially your post, I'd like to start off on the one that discusses where you're like, the most racist thing to say is, I don't see color. And I'm going to misquote you, but like, and I know a lot of things you say are very much like, hey, pay attention here, listen up, listen to what's happening. And then you bring them in but it's the content though. It's so on point. And I was like, well, I could have like 3 hours of just going with you through all these posts because there's so much history in what you're sharing. And so like, I, jumping off what you just said, like there are still things happening. Like literally, you just posted about slavery still exists in America.
Mhm.
And I'm going to say, I was like, oh my God, I did not even know any of this about the Thai Americans. I mean, so I'd love for you to even kind of share and expand on that, what you found in your research, because I know that your 1 minute edit is hours and hours of research that you've done. And then we just get to hear the snippet. And that's all most of us social media intake people usually have the patience for, and the the scrolling whatever thing happens on social. So, but I was fascinated and mortified. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so that's something that's really interesting. I've got a buddy who still works at the Department of Labor, my buddy Paul Chang, and he works in actually a lot of human rights investigations and workers' rights investigations, and
Mm-hmm.
specifically, so he was actually a part of this raid in
Wow.
1995. That was the and what I want to be clear here too, right? Because there's frankly a lot of different things that are really slavery, right? Wage slavery is
Of
one thing where
course. Of
somebody's
course.
working for disrespectfully, unsustainably low wages, right?
Yeah.
There's but and and then certainly there's the prison industrial complex, which takes advantage of
Yes.
a loophole in the 13th Amendment
Yes.
to use prisoners in the American jail system as slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a little different. This is actually, the holding of people against their will, and using them as essentially free labor, without the hope of release. Um, and and that happened, and that happens. And so this case in 1995, was the first time that this kind of modern day slavery was brought to the public's attention. But it still goes on. There's places, there's neighborhoods, even some neighborhoods that people might like and enjoy, and go out for dinner or go walking through. This still happens often, and what's interesting too about this case is, at least in 1995, there were some major clothing retailers who were found to have given contracts to these folks who were holding these 72 Thai laborers illegally and in conditions of slavery. Mm-hmm. And so it's, and like what's the point, right? What's the point? Why do we talk about this? Why do we talk about this as Asian American Pacific Islander heritage? There's 2 points to me. One is that the battle continues. There's these things, whether that's women's rights, whether that's workers' rights, and, like literally freedom from slavery, that again, often we approach as these settled battles. There's these things that at one time we can acknowledge were major issues in our nation and world, but hey, we've moved past that, right? So often the story we're told in textbooks or just in general is one of progress to the modern era. Today the world is better than it's ever been, and I think it's more complicated than that, right? It's not the world. I don't think it's all terrible, but we've got to be realistic about what's in front of us. Otherwise, we never solve it, right? If there's no battles left to fight, then we devolve into complacency. And the other point here, there's actually a couple, right? Like, one is we never get taught, and I know that this is something that you've worked on in your advocacy for Asian American history. We never really get taught. We never address Asian American suffering. Asian Americans, because of the model minority myth, we're often cast as, hey, maybe we went through hard things in Asia. There was war. There was, whatever. People arrived as immigrants. There was a language barrier. But, Asian Americans don't have it hard. Our populations, it's not what it's like for Black folks or for Latinx folks. And that's just not true, right? Both historically, the use of indentured Chinese laborers to build the railroads, as well as contemporarily, American industry and its staggering corporate profits still are often built on the back of Asian bodies, whether in this country or internationally. And so I think part of sharing stories like these are to point out the reality of Asian American belonging, which is, again, not just a belonging in the sense of like, hey, we can become citizens. Hey, look at this successful person who bred the best orange out there. It's Asian Americans belong also in this nation in the sense of the burdens and the scars of this nation's greed and expansion involve us. And that's a different kind of belonging, right? It's one thing to belong when everyone's happy and celebrating. It's another thing to belong when everybody's hurting and scared and recovering from trauma. And I think the point is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders don't just belong in this sense of everyone's happy. We also belong in the sense of we have bled and we have died and we have undergone pain and trauma in this country. And I think that's important to point out as well.
Yeah, especially because I think a lot of people lately, since the pandemic, think, oh, this is new, right? Anti-Asian hate crimes or anti-Asian sentiment is new. And you just have to flip through any of the proper history books or any of the amazing resources out there that will share so many stories from the 80s to the 1800s to the, it's been going on. And I think that's where there's this misconception. Oh, it's just been the last 3 years, because otherwise, the docile, like you said, the model minority myth, that Asian Americans are successful and hardworking, et cetera, and how damaging that is. But what I also wanted to hear you kind of share more about, because I know you've researched it a lot more than I have, in terms of the solidarity and that intersectionality. And I've often been really excited by the fact that here in Florida, because yes, it's Florida where everything's totally fucked up, but especially with education, every other week there's a banned book. And the thing is that there was this fight for Asian American history to be in the same listing as the other histories. And it's like, guess what? The great news is now we get to fight with everybody. Now we are all pulling together because our histories are so intertwined. And I feel like there's this concept of some zero, like, oh no, it's them or us or whatever. And that's the model minority myth too, where they're trying to pit us against one another. And we're super excited now because we're actually having a voice to be able to advocate alongside, African American history and Hispanic heritage and women's contribution. Like now I feel like there's a voice that we can actually help one another. And that is not new either. And a lot of people seem to think that, oh, this is a new thing as Asian Americans being advocates or speaking out. And granted, you have to go through the history books and look, right? You have to look for these things, but they're there, and there's so much solidarity. And I'd love for you to share. I know you have several posts on that, on some of the ones that you feel like people just miss and don't get to hear about.
Yeah, I think that there's yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would further say that the issue is that it isn't in the history books. The issue is that it's in history, yeah, but it's not in the history books. Right.
And then more like biographies, yeah, and book outside books, not ones we get in school, by no means. Yes. Agree.
Yeah. And I know that's the fight that we're fighting, right?
Yes.
Is like they say, right? Whoever controls history gets to be the victor, right? Whoever writes the books gets to be the hero in them. Yeah. And that's, yeah. So certainly I don't want to over romanticize it, right? It's not like everyone was getting along, kumbaya, radical and ready to, fight the power. Like definitely there were tensions.
Yes.
But I do think that the wool has really been pulled over a lot of people's eyes, to think that we talk often as though people in the 1960s and 70s and 1800s, as though people were dumb. And that was simply not what it was. You look back and you really, frankly, had the same dynamics that you have today. You have dynamics of, some people were just trying to assimilate into wealthy society, which meant white society. And they were happy to step on other people's backs in order to get there. And then you had other people who said that's not the way up. That's never going to really result in our freedom. That's just going to result in always having to play into the system that exists. And those people found other people whom that system was hurting, and they joined together. You look at, in Florida, one of my favorite stories is the creation of Seminole communities, right? And these communities were created by Black folks and natives who built these incredible multiracial communities that were able to connect with one another, to live outside the colonial establishments, outside the cities and the townships that were governed by, colonial patriarchal rules. And instead create these multicultural, multiracial, multipolar settlements.
Wow.
that's the kind of thing that I look at. So that's literally from the 1700s when you had, black folks who were being brought over as slaves. They would escape. And where could they go in this nation? They weren't going to get on a boat and go back to Africa. So where they went instead was to native folks. So as much as America has been a history of oppression and exploitation, America also has been a history of the people in the danger zone, finding each other and finding ways to support each other. And that's certainly true of Asians as well as anyone else. If you look at, the Black Panther Party, they were in many ways inspired by revolutionary struggles across the world in their projects. And a lot of folks these days don't really know what the Black Panther Party was about. They think the Black Panther Party, they think of images of people arming themselves to protect their neighborhoods. That was certainly a part of it. But a lot of what the Black Panther Party did was they established schools to teach youth something other than, white supremacist history and culture. They established free food, free meals for people in communities, medicine. All these things were parts of the Black Panther Party's platform and why they were received so strongly by their communities. And so much of that was actually inspired by contemporary Asian revolutionary movements of the time.
Yeah.
So I think that that's so important to point out, because what I hear a lot from folks who are well-intentioned, but they don't know history, is they say, we never had each other's backs. No one was ever looking out for us. You never looked out for us, or you always took from us. You always, and I'll be real, and this is what makes me very sad, is that I hear versions of those accusations going in every direction. I hear Asian folks saying that about Black communities. We were unwelcomed, you stole from us, blah, blah, blah. I hear Black communities saying the same thing about Asian communities. I hear Latinx, there's been this really great brainwashing effort that takes all of our communities and points our fingers at each other instead of pointing at the system that places us in this place. And I think that's why we've got to understand history. If we understand history in context, we understand why after, the Great Migration out of the American South, why Black communities were redlined, that were redlined and unable to purchase homes, literally not allowed to find a home in this nation. Why they might respond a certain way to meeting new communities. But at the same time, understanding that historical context, there still were these incredible examples of solidarity and care. You look at, Malcolm X, famous Black revolutionary leader. More people know now, but still many people don't know that one of his closest confidants was Yuriko Chiyama, this radical revolutionary Japanese American woman, who was the first at his side as he lay there dying after being assassinated, and who actually continued her revolutionary commentary and activities and conversation up into this century. And I'll say, there's a reason that many textbooks don't mention Yuri at all and mention Malcolm X. There's a reason that they mention Malcolm X much less than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the version of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s story that they tell is not actually the platform that he was advocating for when he passed.
Yeah, it's an incomplete history and some of it non-existent, right? As it's like it's just becomes watered down or however you want to describe it. But yeah, I find this is the problem we're having and why in some ways we are regressing as a society, especially here in Florida. I'll say it again. There's laws that's being passed. I mean, we're talking about women's rights and things like that, right? But and then you just look around and you go, oh well, this is why, because this is kind of loops me back to my little bit of a rant and dig earlier. Is kids get to learn on how to take a test, right? Instead of getting to learn historical narrative. And I can share that even in just this last month, after our little activity book, it's found its way into some classrooms. And I got the most wonderful feedback from a teacher who shared that she was so thrilled because she didn't have to go to another course to try to learn all the history of Asian American history right away. And I mean, it was accessible. It's a second grade classroom. We're not making anything too complicated, but she said the kids were excited and asking every day, when are we going to learn more about Asian American history? Because she's been doing our lessons in the book one unit at a time. And the kids are asking to learn this because it's interactive, they're having fun. And because we chose here to do something local where kids can say, hey, I ate pho at a restaurant in that district, and they feel a connection, not Asian American kids, all the kids, right? All the students there. And they don't see this as oh, wow, this is some strange, exotic outside thing. This is what's happening in where I live. It becomes very American, very Floridian, and very true to them. And it's a small win, but it's like, this is what I see where we can really make change, because I'm hearing students talk about it and how excited they were to learn all these facts. But when I heard teachers, giving testimonial about the fact that students are asking, 8-year-olds are saying, when are we going to learn more about Asian American history in a classroom in Florida? I'm like, okay, I'm going to have bad days most days when I hear all the news and all the things, but I'm going to take that little nugget of excitement, of progress. And in so many ways, we're regressing because we're not learning. But I feel like because of people like you going around the country and educating, and a lot of the advocates, that this kind of goes back to our actions make a difference, and it really can. And even though it feels bottomless, like, okay, every time we take 2 steps forward, there could be 10 back, and we're fighting against all the forces. It's still relevant. Like, everything we're doing is relevant. And I was super excited to hear that, right? I mean, kids wanting to learn more in school about anything is an exciting thing anyway, but I was so moved. And I think these are the reasons we need better history classes that are complete. Like you said, I would love to learn about more of the actual Dr. Martin Luther King's narrative and more about Malcolm X. I only learned about Yuri in the last 3, 4 years, ever since the pandemic, to be honest. The very first vigil I went to from the Atlanta spa shooting, we were going through and researching, and then we pulled a quote from her, and that's when I learned. I mean, I was in my 40s, it's just super embarrassing, right? And these are the things that also bring us together, because then it gives us talking points. It gives us some reason to say, hey, look, this is history that's happened, and then we can kind of get on the same page with, instead of fighting, right? And so, yeah, it's fascinating. And I wish I had more hours and more days in the week to just take in information, because there's so much of it out there that we didn't get to learn. And I'm hoping this next generation will get to learn about more complete history for all the histories, because, even on your post, I was very excited. I did learn about some of the things, like the farmer rights with the Filipinos and the Mexican farmers. I was like, yes, I knew that, right? And so I go through your post, and I get very excited over things that I've heard of. One of the ones that actually, when I started this whole journey, was the birthright citizenship that floored me. That floored me. The Wong Kim arc versus the U.S. Like that, when I started to get involved in this initiative and dig into Asian American history and learn, like when I learned that it was the Chinese American and his story, and why now that's a law for like all Americans. I was like, wow, that would have made a
Mhm.
huge difference had I seen that growing up in school. I wouldn't have felt the way I felt. And I hope that changes for others too. And I think, like you said, you didn't get to learn anything. And especially Lunar New Year, right? In school, like you still didn't really learn anything about history. It was just like, here's the moon, like here's the celebration, here's what they do. It had nothing to do with, it's not even really very enriching in the way that it's presented, at least for us here, really like I don't think I got to cover it in elementary at all. I was at a Catholic school though too. So not really celebrating like, oh, let's do all the cultures. Like we got to learn a lot about Catholic holidays.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think, and that's what's also so great about this month is that it's not culture, it's heritage, right? And a lot of people don't understand the difference because culture, yeah, Chinese culture is great, Korean culture is great, but we're not talking about that this month. We're talking about our history and our heritage, which is our Asian American heritage, and that's why, I remember, like definitely, the number one known named Asian American that people know is Bruce Lee, which not taking anything away from him, but he's the one person people can point to as an Asian American. And I think that's exactly what you're pointing towards, right? Which is that people are losing out, not on just Asian stuff, but on American stuff, right? If you don't know about Wong Kim Ark, if you don't know about Yuri Kochiyama, if you don't know about Grace Lee Boggs or Bhagat Singh Thind or so many, Larry Itliong, right? If you don't know about these figures, you're actually missing out on something that can help you today. And that's a big point, I think, for history, for American heritage, which is that, and this may be a little conspiracy sounding, but I think that history feels boring when it doesn't matter to you, right? When you don't understand why something matters.
Yes.
When history is in 1872, this guy got elected president. In 1943, this act was passed, and that changed this part of American law. Who cares? But if we're talking about a history that matters, we're talking about, hey, Wong Kim Ark, this Chinese guy, he went in front of the Supreme Court, and that's why people born in America are American today, right? If we talk about Larry Itliong and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and we say what they did with the great worker strikes in California in the Central Valley, that led directly to people today who work in agriculture being able to fight for fair treatment, to not be slaves, to not be treated however by the companies. Now all of a sudden history becomes alive. But then people also start asking some really awkward questions. And again, history is a battlefield. This is what I said at my lecture last Thursday. I said, history is not the backdrop, it's the battlefield. And I think that we have so often grown accustomed to thinking of history as this, stuff that happened a long time ago with people that weren't really like us. What's important is here and now. And if that's how we understand history, how can we not disregard it? How can we not think, hey, stuff happened, I guess, but it didn't. I don't think it matters to me. So now is the most important time of any time. And what that does is it strips us from a resource that we should have, right? Everything I do is drawn from, and I know you know this from your work as an activist. I know you also know this from your work in martial arts, right? Everything we do is built on the people who came before. And if you don't understand how, Wing Chun was created for smaller women's and girls' bodies, or you don't understand how, traditional jiu-jitsu became Brazilian jiu-jitsu and incorporated, different techniques and forms and evolved. If you don't understand history, you don't understand the moves that you're making today and how to adapt them to whatever happens tomorrow. So I think that's the significance for me of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month is it equips us. It's actually not about us looking back. It's about us being able to look forward, being able to take something forward with us. That is the foundation for the fights that we're having today and tomorrow.
Well said. Thank you so much. I don't want to take up more of your time because that's actually perfect way to end the podcast. You're so, articulate in everything that you share. And like I said, I could literally go on every post and go, tell me more, but I know our listeners will do just that. And, Jason sharing those posts by no means is just, hey, everything is that you need to know has been in this minute and a half. He's encouraging you to continue that learning, right? There's so many resources and he often lists them and everything. So I feel like people always ask, oh, what should I be doing when this massacre happens or this happens or that? I said, speak to someone, learn something, ask about stories and be informed, because you're right. If we don't know our history, then we can't learn, and we can't learn from the mistakes, but we also can't learn from the successes, right? Like, it's not all supposed to be positive, but we do need to recognize that history has some really, really dark moments, but that's how we learn. And thank you so much for coming on to talk and educate me. As always, I get to learn so much from you, and especially about AAPI Heritage Month. And it's been a real pleasure. And I know that you are the kindest ever to fit me into your schedule, and that we will definitely talk again in the very near future.
See you soon, Sifu Mimi. Take care, y'all.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram or Facebook.